It's an ideal song to introduce our next speaker, having a song from the police before a security talk, and specifically Chris's topic on regulations. You listen to the lyrics of the police song, an SOS to the world. So I know a lot of electric utilities have sent that SOS to bring Chris in to help them. So Chris Humphreys, he has managed critical infrastructure programs for the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense counterintelligence field activity. At DHS, Chris was the development lead for the National Infrastructure Coordinating Center, which serves as the operations center for processing and sharing all intelligence data and that is associated with critical infrastructure. Chris was the manager of counterintelligence operations for all DoD critical infrastructure protection, focused on defense industrial base, asset protection for both the physical and cyber threat. Chris has also served as the critical infrastructure compliance manager for audits and investigations at Texas Reliability Organization and the founding chairman for the Critical Infrastructure Protection Compliance Working Group. He has led and/or participated in more than 50 NERC CIP audits. He is a certified computer information systems security professional, program management professional, and a former U.S. Army Signals Intelligence officer. And he is fresh back from his honeymoon, so please join me in welcoming Chris Humphreys.
All right. Rich, thanks for that nice introduction. First thing I want to start off with is 20 years for PAS. I'm going to put that into perspective. I was 15 when they started. But I really appreciate Eddie showing the history of the company and the organization yesterday. That movie clip was awesome because I can identify with that. I mean, I started the Anfield Group 4 years ago, and a couple utilities took a chance on me, and now we're having the growth that we're having. And if in 20 years I can stand up here and be half as successful as PAS has, I'll be extremely ecstatic. So I really appreciate that background, and PAS definitely should be commended for what they've done over the last 20 years. It's been really impressive. So with that, I'll get into my presentation here. Like I said, like my bio said, I'm the former manager of audits and investigations for Texas RE. I was the first NERC CIP audit manager there, and through version 1, version 2, version 3, and now we're moving into version 5. I know we've got a very diverse audience, and you're hearing a lot about NERC. I think as far as the regulatory climate goes, NERC is what everyone's kind of basing off of as far as a regulatory framework with penalties and sanctions, but I'm going to make this tangible to our oil and gas and our chemical and water folks as well, to kind of learn from the mistakes the electric utility sector has made and kind of the good things about it as well, and there are some. Here's what I'm going to talk about: the regulatory landscape. These are just a couple. The NERC, kind of the NIST transition. I'm going to leverage a lot of what Eric spoke about before. I'm going to piggyback on a lot of that and reinforce that. And then I'm going to talk about security controls design and optimization. And then lastly, leveraging technology to sustain your program. My whole mantra is I'm a regulator, but I'm a security guy first. I'm an operations guy first. If you're doing that right, compliance should be a natural byproduct of sound controls and processes, not compliance dictating how you implement your security and operations programs. The common utility, I'm going to click through these pretty quickly. It's just some overview of what I typically see at a vertically integrated utility: generation, transmission, distribution. All these components here that you see listed have some sort of compliance component to it. They all have that similar, I'll call it a burden or challenge, if you will, depending on the framework that they're dealing with and depending on the vertical that they have within the organization. This was interesting. I don't know if anybody's ever seen this, but this report of the state of the electric utility, 95% polled in that report said that they anticipate the regulatory model will change over the next 10 years. I think that's pretty accurate. And then the pressing challenges, you've got old infrastructure, the regulatory model is number 2, the aging workforce, and all the way down, I was surprised that 12 was cybersecurity, but I bet you if you poll them again in another couple of years, that'll move up significantly. Multiple compliance frameworks, the compliance landscape at a utility. NERC CIP is version 5 is bringing a lot more utilities into the fold of having to deal with NERC CIP. Under the previous versions, it was a risk-based model where you came up with your own methodology, and as long as you considered certain things, you could decide whether you had critical assets or not, and would therefore have to comply with the remaining NERC CIP standards. Now in version 5 of the CIP2 standard, it has an attachment 1 criteria that gives you black and white, if you have this, you are applicable. So that's now bringing a lot of folks into the fold on the NERC side. But utilities also have FERC standards of conduct. They have their Public Utility Commission regulations that they have to deal with, SOX, ISO, PCI, NIST, depending on the utility and depending on the programs that are under them. They all have one problem though. I go to many utilities that have multiple compliance frameworks and they're completely siloed. Completely different policies, completely different procedures. Controls, if they have them. Again, controls is kind of it's the hot topic right now because these regulatory frameworks are moving to more of a controls-based audit format. So I'm going to go into some controls 101 stuff, assuming that some people know a lot about controls, but it's okay if there are people in this audience that don't know what security controls are. But the point I'm trying to make is the compliance departments at these utilities never talk to each other, have completely different tool sets, have completely different policies and programs. So cybersecurity regulation, NERC CIP version 5, you've got the NERC physical security standard that's coming out, the new sets of standards that some would argue is a complete knee-jerk reaction to the Metcalf substation incident on the West Coast. You have the NIST framework. ESC2 M2 isn't really a regulatory framework. It's a tool set from the Department of Energy. Very similar to the DHS CSET tool, but that's a tool like the gentleman spoke yesterday from DHS that you can leverage, has a great internal assessment model that you guys can use on your own to kind of assess and evaluate your security posture and the landscape at your organization. Oil and gas, the ISO framework that I was looking at, the 29001, is more of a quality management component, but has some security in it as well. And then NIST. When we started with NERC CIP, we all said, anybody who, my background coming out of DHS, a lot of us said, leverage NIST. Don't reinvent the wheel, guys. There are frameworks out there that we can apply to the electric space that are going to be just fine. But no, we had our standards process, we got this huge drafting team together, we had to sing Kumbaya, and now we're 5 versions into it, and now there is some correlation to NIST, but after 5 versions, we're just now seeing some synergies there. When we had frameworks that were far more mature when the NERC CIP framework came out. And NIST, as Eric spoke earlier, and I'll leverage that a little bit more, President Obama's executive order, the NIST cybersecurity framework, as that evolves too, it'll be interesting to see how that is applied to all critical infrastructure, which is what its intent is, not just the electric space. So here's a little bit about, again, I'll click through this pretty quickly. Maybe some of our oil and gas and other sectors aren't familiar with kind of the regulatory penalty threshold with NERC. It's got a $1 million per day per penalty threshold authorization. So penalties are calculated daily, and they have the authority to assess $1 million per day per penalty. That's the highest penalty in any regulatory framework in North America. Granted, I think the base case for this was the FPL fine that unfortunately FPL kind of, I think, wanted to be, they made them the example. for the authority that they have, but rarely do you see penalties assessed that heavily going forward now. But they are authorized to do so depending on the severity. Again, industry formed standards drafting teams, and we've got version 5 that everyone's ramping up for now and working over the next 2 years to become compliant with that. There's some correlation to NIST, and the requirements now dictate criticality, like I said earlier, whereas before it's been sort of a gray area whether you choose to declare critical assets and critical cyber assets or not. Now you have some hardened requirements that are going to dictate that criticality and bring a lot more utilities into the fold under this applicability for NERC CIP. So here's kind of what's covered by CIP. You know, at the top of that graphic there, you've got the bulk electric system, critical assets, then critical cyber assets, and the critical cyber asset subset is kind of like, if you start there, you focus your protection and security posture there. That's really the nuts and bolts of the NERC CIP once you get beyond BES identification, critical asset identification, and critical cyber assets. So your switches, your firewalls, all your network devices, your servers, your technology, those are components that are going to support the operation of those critical assets and critical cyber assets. Here's the CIP timeline of how we got to where we're at. So if you look back in '98, there was a presidential directive 63, kind of came through 2000. I think the real kind of catalyst, the urgent action 1200 in 2002. But then you look version 1 in the FERC order, just like we have the reaction now to the Metcalfe substation incident, and we're going to have a whole new set of physical standards. Right then and there was about the time of the Aurora vulnerability being compromised. I don't know if you guys have seen that YouTube clip of the generator being blown up from hacking the SCADA software, but that was a DHS classified program that someone leaked. I happened to be at DHS at the time of that, but I did not do it. But that was kind of, again, the program that came out. It wasn't news to folks like you guys. You know, people thought of this threat a long time ago, and people always kind of had that what if, but the aha moment was when CNN's broadcasting the clip from the project of the generator being destroyed. And you would argue that kind of jump-started CIP 1 and CIP 2 getting this regulatory framework in place. So we had version 3 go in 2010, version 4, which ended up being bypassed altogether to go straight to version 5, which in another 2 years, it'll be interesting for me to see what version we will be on while everyone's trying to get ready for version 5, or if we're answering to NERC at all, which I'll get into that a little bit more later. And we've talked about this already, physical protection standards. Again, this is my take that it seems timely that, you know, right after the Fox News runs the whole thing 4 months after the Metcalfe incident happens, that we now have a new regulatory framework coming for physical. Again, reactive legislation and regulation instead of proactive security-driven posture based on viable threat. People, we know, all of you in here that are asset owners know how your systems can be compromised. A physical attack, someone's sitting there with a low-caliber rifle and shoot out a transformer. We've thought of that for years. One, how do you really protect against that? I mean, yes, we could take some more safeguards, but the point I'm trying to make is until that actually happens and someone maybe coordinates an attack on multiple transformers at the same time, you're talking about the intent there. You know, is it vandalism? Is it sabotage? You know, that's the defining line and the method of attack, but we've thought of these things for years. We wait until it happens to react and implement legislation and regulation, which isn't right. I don't think that's sustainable. National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, Cybersecurity Framework, mandate from President Obama's executive order, first release came out in the fall. It's kind of a compilation of industry best practices, as Eric spoke earlier. It's a very good place to start. It really is. It has a compilation of best practices and gives you a place to kind of lay the foundation for your program. But the long-term intent for this is to make it applicable to all critical infrastructures. Now, those of us in the NERC field have seen this movie before. Everything we've seen about the NIST framework is it's voluntary, you know, it's a guide to help you guys get ready and do things. NERC was voluntary when it started, and here's where we are now. So I'm just kind of putting that, putting that out there that, like I said, I've seen this movie before, and it wouldn't surprise me that some variant of the NIST framework ends up being the regulatory model for all critical infrastructure at some point in the near future. That's just my crystal ball, my personal crystal ball. National Institute for Standards and Technology, I've always been a fan of NIST. Back at DHS when I was there, and even in the military and my field there, we always leveraged NIST. 800 series, those special pubs, if you can implement those verbatim, you're going to be fine. But like Eric said earlier, some of that stuff is, if you can't sleep at night, print out 800-53 and read that cover to cover. I guarantee you'll go to sleep within 10 minutes. But it has, if you can digest it, I think that's sort of closer to the ceiling of compliance and balancing security are the 800 series pubs. And those are just some of the, there's a whole series of them. Those are some of the topics that it covers. But I think those are the most robust guidance for security. You've got the ESC2 model that was put out by DOE. It's sort of an assessment framework. There's no penalties or fines, but again, you can just go get the ESC2 tool from the DOE site, just like the DHS CSET tool. There are several tools out there that you guys can baseline your program off of and sort of assess your maturity as you go. The problem you have is a lot of the folks have been driven by compliance that are bringing in the electric utility space. They've never had to spell CIP before version 5, so even baselining their program, some of them don't have a program to baseline. So the NIST framework, starting there, looking at NERC, and implementing some of these free tools out there to kind of measure yourself and grade yourself as you go are critical to maturing your program. So this is another one, ISO TS 29001. I'm pretty familiar with the ISO frameworks. I've looked at those. This is sort of a quality management focus. There's a link to that framework. There are some security components in there. I believe oil and gas will end up leveraging some instance of NERC and the NIST framework combined. If not, NIST be the framework and NERC be the regulatory model that NIST adopts as far as penalties and sanctions go. That is just my personal take of how, again, coming from DHS in the federal space to working for a NERC region and auditing to now seeing DHS come back full circle eventually, I just think that's how it's going to go. That's my personal view. Compliance does not equal security still. Regulatory bodies are trying to bridge this gap. It's still reactive versus proactive. Again, regulatory frameworks for me still are the floor of security. So many people have their operations and their security postures dictated by compliance because at the end of the day, the executive teams, C-level folks, they just want to say, am I compliant? Am I going to keep these fines out of here? Am I going to keep the regulators off my back? That's what their bar is set at. Whereas it's the bare minimum for security at best. I mean, version 5 is getting there a little bit better. They're making steps as they go, but still, do not think because you're compliant with one framework that you're secure. Here's kind of the big picture of how everything works from a regulatory standpoint. This is kind of just, POTUS, President of the United States, all the way down to those various agency departments. Just kind of wanted to put that in there to show kind of how many fingers there are in the pie, if you will, and how many folks are going to have a say in shaping the regulatory landscape going forward when it comes to cybersecurity. This is a cool slide that I like for electric utilities. I call it the regulatory bar fight. My partner works with me, Patrick Miller. You guys might know him. He's like a LinkedIn superstar, and my counterpart at WEC for the Western region for the NERC CIP standards when we were working there together at the time. But you see, this is kind of busy. I don't know if you can really read it from here, but like, transmission lines, substations, all that stuff. You've got PUC, PSC, and FERC. You've got smart metering that's unregulated. You've got distribution regulated by the PUC. And then you've got the plants and switch yards and stuff like that regulated by all those agencies there on the right. NRC, DHS, TSA, EPA, FERC, and NERC. So it's kind of from a compliance perspective, if you're letting compliance dictate all this stuff, that is going to be extremely difficult to holistically manage if you're doing it, in silos and not talking to each other at all. And most of the stuff, and I'll say this is how people dictate their compliance posture. In the fall, the NERC regions issue their audit schedules, and all the utilities in that region are looking at the schedule and saying, dodged a bullet, I'm not on the audit schedule this year. Don't have to worry about it. If I pop on the audit schedule next year, we'll budget for 6 months out, we'll do a gap analysis and a mock audit, and we'll do what we need to, but that should not be the way it goes. Believe me, I run a consulting firm. I'm happy to take your money and do those things, but I do not think that's a sustainable approach. Reacting to dodging a bullet because you're not being audited and not worrying about compliance or security until the next year or whatever. You see a lot of utilities take that approach, and that's really disturbing. There's no regulatory singularity. That previous slide is what I wanted to this is kind of the text that goes with that. FERC can only regulate the BES in some generation. PUCs regulate distribution. And at the end of the day, they have a say in the rate recovery for transmission elements in the BES. It's not security, it's not operations. Utilities are in it to make money. At the end of the day, if it affects their rate case, that's what it boils down to, folks. It's not security, it's not operations, it's a bottom dollar issue. I mean, if I was an executive at a utility, I would have to factor that in too, but I would not make it the single factor in dictating how much money I spend on my security budget. And that last bullet is it's kind of my whole sort of backs up my view that I think eventually it'll be some instance of DHS that we all have to answer to on this. The only agency with the total purview is DHS per multiple presidential directives. Here's the first thing, and this is the IT-OT bridge right here. The one complaint that IT folks and OT folks have in common when I go to a utility and audit them or design their program is that I don't have time to do this compliance stuff in my day job. Does anybody hear that at their utility? Is anybody experiencing, burnout of their staff in 6 to 9 months because they're doing all this compliance crap and that's not in their job description? I hear that all the time. The solution to that is sound operational and security-driven processes and controls that bake in compliance as a natural byproduct. I'm a CI guy, counterintelligence guy by trade in the military. One tactic we have is getting people to do what you want them to do without them knowing they're doing it. Okay? Now, they know that we know that they know that we know. Counterintelligence is we like to sound like we're smart, but we're really not. It's just social engineering. But at the end of the day, if I can get my operations folks and my IT folks to execute a process that they've brought in and a control and have the technology to sustain that, I never have to hear them complain about compliance again. I don't care what the regulatory framework is. Okay? Mapping those security-based and operationally based controls to multiple regulatory frameworks to consolidate that control set, I guarantee you, whether it's NIST, whether it's DHS, whether it's NERC, I don't have to check that audit schedule every year. I can say, come on in, guys, let me show you what I got. And that is far more sustainable from a compliance perspective than, compliance dictating everything you do from an operations and security standpoint and trying to hit this moving target. Okay? For me, I'm a regulator, I'm an auditor. When I hear that, I say, stop doing compliance. Could you imagine if your regulators come in and say, okay, stop doing it. You're doing it wrong, stop doing compliance. Let's make it operations and security focused. There's a reason why I'm not at the regions anymore being an auditor. I'm a what's it called? I'm an auditor in recovery, if you want to call it that. I work the other side of the coin now. So, and controls-based auditing is where these frameworks are moving to. Under the first few versions of NERC, it was, did you have a document dated and signed? You know, show me the output. It wasn't, show me how you got to this. Show me what you did. If you can produce the evidence, check you're compliant. The show your work bullet, I equate it to in school when you're in math and you're doing equations and in long division and all that other stuff, and you have a nice fancy calculator that does all the graphing and everything, but your teacher always used to tell you, you need to show your work. That's kind of where this is going. How did you produce, how did you execute, what controls did you have in place to produce that evidence? You know, right now, auditors come in, they have a one way to see it, and that's it. I expect to see it this way. I expect to see this evidence output. And if you don't have it, you're non-compliant. Well, now we're moving towards a more, let me look at your controls, let me see how you got to where you got. And I think that's a smarter move from a regulatory perspective and a security perspective, but at the same time, depending on your region and the skill level of your auditors, you're going to get into some interesting debates. Controls design. So this is the key to sustaining compliance and being operationally and security focused. These are some types of controls that you have: procedural controls, administrative, technical, preventative, detective. The bare bones, I'm a big fan of the KISS acronym. Everybody know what that is? Keep it simple, stupid. I like to talk to everyone like at a 5th grade level, because some of these guys that I deal with are the engineering side, those guys are way out of my league. It's like I can translate Klingon a little bit to talk to the executives. That's kind of my skill set there. But 101 in controls is a process. Now, you might have steps within a process that could translate to a type of control, but when you think about designing controls, think about a procedure or a process equaling a control at the foundational level. So, security controls design, optimized controls design depend on a holistic view across multiple frameworks. We've seen all these security tool sets, we've seen all these security frameworks that over the last couple days. Why not take the best components of each one, make one control, and they satisfy any other framework you're going to get along with the framework you pick to map that control after. So identifying those interdependencies is key. This is a very busy slide. I apologize for that. I'm not big on busy slides, but trying to get, this is a subset of some of the work that I've done at the Anfield Group, where I've mapped ISO, COBIT, SOX, PCI, NERC CIP, and the SANS top 20 to consolidated control sets, identified the interdependencies. So from that, here's an example of a unified control. So you've got NERC CIP 2, critical asset identification. You've got the SANS top 20 critical controls, which is kind of a subset, if you will, or a Cliff's Notes version of NIST. That was our intent when I was working with SANS on those top 20 critical controls. But inventory of authorized devices, inventory of authorized and unauthorized software, you've got ISO, you've got SOX, but the universal control is there at the bottom. Asset identification that includes ownership and accountability to the asset. That's very, very simple. That's not overly complicated. But by designing that control, you've got, instead of 4, you've got 1 control that are security driven where compliance falls out of all those frameworks. It's a lot of common sense, you know, to try to simplify this stuff. Here's another example. This is more on the reliability side. PRC5 is your relay maintenance and testing program for NERC, but there might be a PUC requirement for the recertification of your maintenance standard. So you have a 693, which is the PRC, the FERC order that PRC5 comes over with your self-certification every year to that standard, but you merge those two to include relay maintenance in that maintenance plan to the PUC. Now you've got 1 control that satisfies both your NERC and PUC obligations. I'm just trying to show the concept here. I don't want to get into the technical, but you can see by merging those very simply, you've now got 1 that satisfies many. Here's another one that was very, another mapping that we did that we're using a lot with our clients right now. Everyone's in version 3 of NERC CIP and has to be under version 3 until version 5 compliance comes. So not only are you ramping up for version 5, which is some major transitioning from, major transitioning from 3 to 5, you have to maintain compliance with version 3 while you're getting ready to go to version 5. And then the SANS Top 20, we went ahead and mapped those to version 5 as a foray into if the NIST framework gains the momentum that we're expecting that it will. Now you've got a consolidated set of controls that sustain your regulatory model the next 2.5 years for NERC version 5, and maybe the next 10 years if NIST matures the way it's supposed to. But instead of completely reacting to whatever regulatory change comes, you've got controls that are put in from day one that satisfy them all. And that's our clients find that's an extremely refreshing approach. The executives love it from an ROI perspective. At the end of the day, the bottom dollar issue there. And the security and operations folks like it because it's less compliance work for them to have to do, and we're building their process, their operational and security processes where the compliance department always can get the outputs for what they need, and the operations and security folks can do their job. Okay, this is the last component, leveraging technology to sustain controls. I've got about 6 minutes left. I'll get through this. Investing in sound processes and controls design is completely useless if you're not leveraging technology. Manual execution versus automation. We had a slide yesterday where I think the use case it was at Southern, it was Rich Powell's presentation. It was 40 people doing NERC CIP stuff at a site has been reduced to 4 by implementing proper process and technology. Think about that. Manual execution of any of this stuff is non-sustainable as these regulatory frameworks mature. But technology is not the magic bullet. Processes and controls must be defined and tested prior to introducing technology. If you're automating bad process with technology, you're going to get garbage in, garbage out. Okay, so there's a time and place for everything. Technology is not a magic bullet. A big vertical for my company is technology integration. We have a lot of different vendor partners that we deal with, and we bring them in at an appropriate time. But our perspective versus the sales perspective of that particular vendor is often very different because the sales guy's there to close the deal, 6 to 8 weeks, you've got the product, you're up and running. No, that may be the case, but you've got to factor in the investment on the client side of roles and responsibilities, that implementation plan, who's going to own that, who's going to be the end user of that, and the investment on your side on resources to get that technology to work the way you want it to work. I see so many people that are very quick to knee-jerk react to a penalty that they've received and throw money at buying a solution, but their process was bad in the first place. You know, that doesn't work. That is not where it needs to be. But people are very quick to blame technology for their failures, but at the end of the day, technology is just a tool. People and processes first, then technology. So here's some of the verticals, just a couple of them, to sustain these controls. Incident and event management, security logging, and again, these are just ones I've seen. The only ones that I really have direct familiarity with is the last bullet there in the configuration management side. I think you've heard some of the Tripwire folks and Novatech and PAS all mention the new NERC Alliance that Tripwire's put together. The Anfield Group is part of that alliance. Our component is the controls and process design to that alliance, and then in the configuration management space, you have Tripwire, Novatech, and PAS, all with a complementary solution. So we're kind of the boots on the ground that come in and build processes and controls for the alliance that set up the implementation of these tool sets to sustain that program that we've built. Very exciting about that. Configuration management is something that is getting far more robust. In version 5, we now have an entire reliability standard focused on configuration management. In the previous versions, we had 1 or 2 sub-requirements that said, you'll do configuration management, but doesn't give you any specificity as to how or what's expected. But requirement 1 of CIP 10 in version 5 is, you'll have a baseline for every device. And that seems like security 101 to most of us in here, but you'd be surprised at how many utilities I go to don't know what a baseline is, don't know how to establish one, and don't know how to maintain one. I mean, it shocks me, but now you have a regulatory driver forcing you to look at that, and I'm hoping that the other sectors, oil and gas, chemical, water, you guys need to learn from the electric space's mistakes in that you have to invest in those processes and controls first. You know, you do not want to be in the boat where, you know, you're reacting to a framework coming and now you've never done any of this stuff before. Okay? I've got just a couple minutes left to go. Another vertical that we're seeing a lot of action in is governance, risk, and compliance. And that's being used across multiple sectors. Who in here has a GRC deployment that they're using? Anybody seen governance and risk and compliance software? Basically, it's an enterprise level layer that sits on top of all of your point solutions, that workflow automation, documentation management. Some of them have got very advanced to, you know, implementing countermeasures upon detection of a failed control, which is very, very valuable when you're dealing with a regulatory framework that's calculated daily for penalties. So if you can detect something and mitigate all within minutes, rather than 6 months later you're doing a pen test and you find that you had some compromise, now that penalty is calculated over 6 months. If you had the technology in place to detect, alert, and mitigate, that's quite a cost savings in the penalty dollars issue, not to mention the security risk you've mitigated. So actively enforcement of policies, test controls against future regulatory requirements. Some of these GRC platforms are pretty advanced in that you get a new version of a standard that comes out and you want to see how your environment's going to be impacted. Some are better than others at this, but they have technology where you can actually import that new version of the standards and see what controls are impacted, what needs to be modified. So I'm happy to take your money and come in and do a 3 to 6 month assessment and map out a transition plan from one version to the next. I'm happy to do that. But there's technology out there that you guys can do that yourselves. And the cost savings are pretty substantial once you factor all that in and the time you spend. So in closing, perfect. Last slide, clock just expired. In closing, develop operational security-driven processes and controls across all regulatory requirements. Compliance is a natural byproduct. It won't matter who the regulator is going to be. And implement the technology to sustain and automate those controls. Any questions? Did this resonate with anybody? Am I speaking a foreign language? You're not going to drink the Kool-Aid, I'm nuts, that's not attainable. I understand the political and bureaucratic challenges with getting everyone to sing Kumbaya. I'm not trying to belittle that. But at the end of the day, from a business case, from an operations case, and from a security case and a compliance case, this is your answer. All right, well, thanks.